Ready to level up your leadership? This is the Growth Project. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Growth Project. This is a big episode, people. If any of my listeners have been to any of my leadership workshops, you know who my next guest is. Today, I am talking with Kwame Christian. Welcome to the Growth Project, Kwame.
Hey, Jason, it is my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Fantastic. Kwame, perhaps you could start by just telling the listeners who you are and what you're about.
Yeah, so my name's Kwame Christian. I'm the founder and CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, and our goal is to make difficult conversations easier. So we believe the best things in life are on the other side of difficult conversations. And so we just want to help you to elevate your career and your lives one difficult conversation at a time. And so we do that through our podcast. We're coming out with a premium offering for our podcast as well. We do it through courses and corporate trainings, keynote speaking, and things like that. So we just try to be as ubiquitous as possible and try to meet people where they are, whether it is through audio channels, with YouTube video channels, and we write for Forbes as well. And it's been really fun to see the audience grow. And that's how we got in touch, connecting through the podcast. And it's just been fun to see people all over the world just latching on to the content and using it in their everyday lives.
Oh, that's exactly how that's been my experience, Kwame. But just to unpack a little bit more, so Kwame, you mentioned the fact that you are the CEO of the American Negotiation Institute, but you're also a business lawyer, negotiation consultant, a Forbes contributor, and your podcast is the world's #1 negotiation podcast, Negotiate Anything. And when I look at all of that and I see your activity on LinkedIn, and my mind blows up. How do you find the time? We spoke a bit offline, but I guess it's a combination of prioritizing, scheduling, and probably the support of some great people, I imagine, as well.
Thank you. Yeah, no doubt. It's I have to give full kudos to my team and my patient family, because if I didn't have their full support, I wouldn't be able to pull this off. And I think right now the biggest challenge is sometimes tempering that ambition and settling down and giving myself permission to rest, because I'm realizing that rest is part of the strategy as well. If I'm not well rested, then I can't perform. Then I'm not as effective as I could be. But you're right. It is a lot. it is a lot, and sometimes it wears on you. But the impact is what we're going for. So to connect with folks like you and to get the feedback from people online and seeing that it's actually helping in meaningful ways, that's really what keeps me going.
Yeah, good on you. And I can't tell you how excited I am to have you here with me, because the reason I came across your podcast in the first place is because of your TED Talk, the famous TED Talk. And I stumbled across this TED Talk back in a period of my life where I was having the realization that I needed to bolster my skills, because I was having a really hard time with difficult conversations at work. And I was having a hard time with those conversations at home with my wife and my kids as well. And especially with the amplification of these issues that COVID provided as well, was for me an awakening to say, I need some development here. And I was really time poor. And I think what a lot of people are finding these days is that things like podcasts are a fantastic tool because they're so portable and convenient. But your TED Talk was the catalyst, I guess, for me and my personal growth and the trajectory that I have found myself on. So I'm thrilled that we're actually connecting over this, and you've been really generous with your time as well. So it's really appreciated, but I'm very, very excited for this.
Yes. Oh, that's great. That's great. I appreciate that. And I think for me, this feedback is always helpful with the TED Talk too, because that was a major point of evolution for me as a speaker. Because, going through school, seeing professors present, I was very professorial in the way that I presented. And I remember the first time I ran through the TED Talk with the team, they said, it sounds like a workshop. I said, yes, that's exactly what I'm going for. They're like, people don't want that. You need to show who you are. You have charisma and charm, but I'm not seeing it in the way that you're presenting. Just be more vulnerable. I was like, that's exactly what I don't want to do. So that was really the first presentation where I was more myself and allowed myself to be myself on stage and not be as academic with my presentation, but try to be more practical and make everything a lot more accessible. So it was scary for me because I had to get over that imposter syndrome and be myself on stage. So to hear that it resonated so well, that means a lot. So I appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure. And before we really jump into the content, I'll just say to the listeners, you don't want to miss this entire episode. There's going to be so many golden little nuggets that you're going to come across that Kwame will drop. And also there might be a little hint of something that might be of interest to a lot of Australian listeners as well that we'll mention towards the end. So Kwame, I might just come back to your point though about vulnerability and the fact that you accepted that vulnerability and integrated that into what you were doing. And I think that's a really relevant topic to my listeners because what I often see and hear from these people is that it is just really uncomfortable acknowledging that I've got work to do on my emotions, and my emotional regulation perhaps is probably one of the biggest barriers that people are experiencing from my client cohort. So I guess vulnerability probably plays quite tightly with that aspect.
Absolutely. It's so important. And I think it's important for us to get an understanding of what vulnerability is and what it isn't, because oftentimes it's the misunderstandings around vulnerability that hold people back from being vulnerable. So vulnerability is not sharing every intimate detail about what you're thinking and what you've been through. That can be very overwhelming, not only for you as the person being vulnerable, but as the person receiving that vulnerability. It can be really overwhelming. But being vulnerable really is being willing to open yourself up to show the relevant parts of yourself for the conversation. So you don't need to air out all of your dirty laundry. You just need to feel comfortable enough or accept the fact that you will advance in the relationship and in the conversation by sharing. And so this comes in many different levels. So from a business transactional type of sense, me as a business lawyer negotiating these contracts, a lot of times people are saying, well, I have maybe some liabilities that I don't want to share, or I have some business vulnerabilities, some parts of my business that aren't as strong that I don't want to share during this negotiation that might be relevant, but I don't want to share it because I'm uncomfortable sharing that part of me. Or there might be some concerns I have about the future, but I only want to portray strength as I define strength. So I don't want to share that information. But what ends up happening is that it leads us to navigate the conversation where we are holding back information that might be relevant, and the other person can sense that you're holding something back, but they don't know what you're holding back or why you're holding it back. And whenever there's that ambiguity, it is in their best interest psychologically to interpret that negatively in order to protect themselves. So even though what you're hiding from them may not be threatening to them, they will perceive it as a threat, and it'll decrease the amount of connection that you have with the other person. And what I found is that when you are vulnerable, it creates an air of psychological safety that makes it more okay for the other person to reciprocate that vulnerability. And so what I do is I divvy it out. So I say, I'm going to share a little bit of myself, and then I'm going to see if they reciprocate. Then they reciprocate, and then I give a little bit more. So we are incrementally deepening the trust and the relationship in this conversation. But if I go and I just say, air out all of my dirty laundry, the other person's like, ugh, do they expect me to do that? I don't feel comfortable doing that. Not yet. So there's a lot of strategy that goes into it. But I think this is something I want to circle back to throughout the conversation. At the end of the day, it's people being people. It's just two people having a conversation and connecting on a deeper level. And a lot of times that unwillingness to open up and be vulnerable prohibits us from connecting in a really powerful way, and it makes it harder for us to accomplish our goals at the end of the day.
Wow, so many amazing insights there. And an amazing insight there was in particular around how we might be perceiving vulnerability as a threat from our perspective, but and I hadn't thought of that before around the fact that can create the perception of a threat to the other person. I'm glad you unpacked that, because that's probably the biggest barrier in making some positive change and exploring emotional intelligence. But we see all the time that these people And for context, maybe it's a contractor or a tradesperson who has a really fantastic set of technical skills, and they're promoted or pushed or thrust into a leadership position. And the assumption is that, well, this person was a fantastic tradesperson. They must be a fantastic leader, or they will be a fantastic leader. And we know that those two realms are different. But what we see is that they're having such a hard time with difficult conversations because they're dealing with a much wider range of stakeholders all of a sudden. It's not just people on work sites or construction sites. It's now corporate people as well. So there's a whole new set of challenges and different contexts and styles and types of conversations. So why do you think people struggle so much to adjust to these kinds of situations?
Well, I think the reason why people struggle with these types of situations is the same reason I would struggle if I were to take their position as a contractor. I don't have the skills. I've never practiced. It would be completely unrealistic for us to assume that I could be a good contractor. And it would be unrealistic to assume that they have the leadership and conversational skills unless they were particularly trained on that. So one of the things that we hear in everyday conversation a lot of times is the 10,000 hour rule. In order to become a master at something, you need to log 10,000 hours. But they often forget this really important point. It's 10,000 hours of deliberate practice. So here's the difference. Everybody has 10,000 hours of talking as a human. That doesn't mean we are expert communicators. We're not all expert communicators because we were communicating, but we weren't communicating with intentionality of improving the skill of communication. And so what we have to do is we have to recognize that the ability to lead, persuade, manage conflict, those are individual skills that are not innate to most people. And we have to recognize there's a difference between being right and being persuasive. So if we're going to school, we go to school, we take our tests, we get the right answer, then we get our grades. So we think that's the way the world works. So we become a leader in our organization. We say, hey, I got to this point because I had the right answers. I did a good job. I have the skills. And now as a leader, we just say, hey, direct report, I need you to do this. I know because I have the right answer. But there's a difference between being right and being persuasive. Simply giving the people the right answer and telling them what to do doesn't always result in what we want them to do. And so we have to recognize that we need to develop this skill in order to be more effective. And if we want to be better at negotiation, conflict resolution, or communication in general, there are three main things that we need to do. If you can elevate your skills in these three main dimensions, you'll be good. Number one, we need to ask better questions. Negotiation is an information game. Ask better questions, get more information. Number two, in order to fully avail ourselves to the benefit of good questions, we need to become a better listener. So we need to improve our listening skills. And then number three, we need to manage emotions, both ours and the other person in the room. And that last part is really, really tough because it requires us to not only be vulnerable with other people, but also vulnerable with ourselves, because a lot of times we are not willing to admit that we don't have it all together. And then we try to force ourselves through a conversation when we ourselves are not emotionally ready. And then as a result, it's triggering for the other person. And instead of having a communication endeavor with somebody else, it's just two people who are within close proximity emoting at each other and not listening to each other. And so if you can improve on those three dimensions, that's when you start to improve your ability to connect, lead, manage, and persuade.
And those three things, that's been my experience. What you described in focusing on those things has been pivotal for me. And it can be really difficult, as you said. And the frustrating thing is, you mentioned the 10,000 hour rule. So in order to get better, you have to accept that you are going to be in discomfort a lot.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that acceptance is so important, right? I call it productive pain. So for instance, if we are in the gym and we're working out hard, it's going to be uncomfortable, but that pain is productive because as we stay in that space of productive pain longer, we get more physical benefits. Same is true with every single skill that we want to develop. It's difficult, it's arduous, it takes time, but the more time you can spend in that period of discomfort, the more comfortable you will be in that uncomfortable situation. So we can't necessarily make these conversations easy, but we can make them easier. We can't make you feel comfortable, but we can make you feel more comfortable. And if you can recognize that in the process of growing and developing, you will feel a certain level of discomfort, and you kind of change your perspective and say, hey, this discomfort is a signal that I'm actually on the right path. Now you start to grow with regularity. And then you start to recognize these negotiations, these difficult conversations are everywhere. Let's go back to what you said at the beginning, Jason, because you recognize I was struggling in these conversations at work and at home. Okay, now I can recognize the difficult conversation I have with my son, the difficult conversation I have with my spouse. Those are opportunities to practice. And if I go into those conversations with the intentionality of practicing and improving my skills, it makes it more of a habit that I will put these skills into play when it matters the most, both at home and at work. So we just want to make sure that we are thinking really intentionally about these interactions that we're having, and then we can turn every single interaction into a practice opportunity too.
Absolutely. And when we do go into these practice opportunities or any hard conversation, what do you believe are the most common reasons people might find themselves tripping up within these conversations? What sort of things are people likely to notice when maybe a conversation hasn't gone to plan?
I think here's one of the things that I've realized, and it's so simple, it's so obvious, but it took me years to realize it. One of the biggest challenges people have isn't that they don't know what to do or say. It's that they don't have the discipline to do it long enough. So let's talk about the three dimensions: asking better questions, listening effectively, and managing emotions. You might be able to manage emotions for 5 minutes, but if you lose it after the 6th minute, the conversation breaks down. You might be able to listen for 10 minutes, but after the 11th minute, if you stop listening, conversation breaks down, right? And so it requires a lot of discipline and restraint to do the right thing for a prolonged period of time. And a lot of times, if we haven't taken the time to build these skills with intentionality, we might be able to implement the skill for a short period of time, but we don't have the mental and emotional endurance to do the right thing long enough. So what I've recognized, Jason, is that in these tough conversations, the biggest challenge isn't necessarily strategic or tactical. It's more emotional and psychological. So not only knowing what to do, but also recognizing your own internal triggers and recognizing what psychologically might be holding you back, what's creating your personal performance gap, so you can start to solve for the right problem. Because if you just say, oh, I'm not good at negotiation, oh, I'm not good at difficult conversations, I need to practice my skills a little bit more, that will help for sure. But you'll still run into this performance gap and you won't understand why you're still struggling, because it can ultimately be more disempowering if you recognize, I know what to do, but there's something inside of me that won't let me do it. When it's time to actually do it, what is that? So it requires a lot of introspection to figure out what's holding you back from putting these tools into practice when it actually matters.
Yeah, and here's the thing too, Kwame. So when people do go into these conversations with intentionality, and perhaps they're self-reflecting post-conversation and thinking that, oh, look, there are still some elements that I tripped up on, and I could have done this better, or I didn't quite regulate my emotions well enough when we touched on this topic. And what we tend to see is that within those realizations, there's a panic that, oh, look, I better stay away from these things now because I'm causing damage to my relationships whilst I'm developing these skills. And what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of people who are starting to shy away and back away from that growth intention because of the concern around the damage they're doing in the meantime. But what can people do after a difficult conversation that has perhaps derailed, where they can perhaps recover? You know, what kinds of things can people do to stem this issue whilst they're developing their skills, because they will be more aware of the performance gap than they were before if they have this mindset?
Yeah, so let's start internally. So first, what we have to do is we want to treat ourselves like our own coach. After every difficult conversation, we want to replay the tape and ask ourselves, what did I do well? Let me try to replicate that and do more of that in the future. What did I do poorly? Let me try not to make the same mistake twice. And as long as you're thinking of yourself as your own coach, you can take these previous conversations as opportunities to grow and learn. So your goal is to not make the same mistake twice and keep on doing what you're doing really well. And that way you're getting incrementally better with every single interaction. And then what we want to do externally is we want to have a conversation with the person after a tough conversation too. And they did the study on marriages that work. And what they recognize is that the most successful relationships are the ones where after a difficult conversation or a disagreement, they have repair attempts. So they touch base after the fact to check in with the other person to see how they're doing. A lot of times what ends up happening is people don't know how to effectively address the elephant in the room, and so they ignore it. And it comes off almost like gaslighting, where you're trying to pretend like everything is okay when it's clearly not. So you had a really tough conversation in the past, and then you just come in front of them the next day. Hey, how you doing? Yeah, great day today. No, that's weird. You kind of have to address it, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't need to be anything profound. And I think this is one of the most miraculous things that I've recognized about these tough conversations. People go into these conversations, or they're afraid to go into these conversations because they don't know what to say. Saying, I don't know what to say is completely okay. So let's say, Jason, we have a tough conversation yesterday. And so what I'll say is something like this. Hey, Jason, I just want to say, I appreciate the fact that you trust me enough to have a tough conversation. I know yesterday we covered a lot of difficult topics. And so I just wanted to check in to see how you're doing. Something as simple as that, right? That I made that up off the fly. Probably not the best delivery, but it shows vulnerability and that I care. I acknowledge that something happened. I'm checking in because I care, and that's it. And then we just let the conversation flow. And just doing something like that gets us to a point where we're generating some positive momentum. So don't just try to brush it under the rug, because if you're feeling it, it's likely that they are too. Just a little check-in, a little repair attempt like that can go a long way.
So simple, right? Yeah, absolutely. So how much importance, though, would you put on the timing of any kind of, whether it's a follow-up from a difficult conversation or the difficult conversation itself? How important is the timing?
Yeah, this is a great question. And so let's talk about perception. And I'm not going to talk about legitimacy of that perception. I'm just going to talk about perception. So if something happens to me and it takes me a long time to address it, the perception on the other side is that it wasn't that big of a deal. So it might have been a very big deal. I might not have talked about it because I was hurt or traumatized or terrified or whatever it happens to be. And it took me weeks to galvanize the strength to have this conversation. But the perception on the other side is you're bringing up something from so far ago in the past. It wasn't a big deal to me. I didn't think it was a big deal to you. Now you're bringing it up now. There's a skepticism of what you're bringing just because of the time. The amount of time it takes for you to bring it back to the other person could potentially invalidate what it is that you're saying inappropriately. It's not a fair perception, but we have to understand the psychology that we're dealing with. So in my mind, I try to put like a 24 to 48 hour shot clock on when it comes to these types of things. Because a lot of times when we start to think about what I should say, what I should do, how should I approach this, a lot of times what's ending up happening is that it's just a really sneaky manifestation of fear. So we are over-intellectualizing the process in order to put more time between us and the stimulus and the response. And so I think it's good to give yourself time to sleep on it, give yourself time to process things, to think it through and get a little bit more emotional stability. I think that's good. But we have to recognize that there's a bit of a Goldilocks zone. And if you wait too long, it kind of invalidates the response. You know, especially if you flip the script, you might be hurt. It invalidates your claim to the hurt that you're sharing. But if you're the person who inadvertently hurt somebody else and it takes you a while to step up and apologize or check in, then they are wondering the whole time, man, Kwame hurt my feelings and he didn't even care to check in. Wow, he does not care about me at all, right? And so we have to manage those perceptions, and the timing is going to play a major role in that calculation too.
Wow. Yeah, the perception, simply the perception, that's such an important consideration. I agree. And I love the concept too of a shot clock, and putting it in those terms is really powerful. Within that shot clock time period, what would be your top tips on how to prepare for the conversation within that shot clock time?
Yeah, so I think this is a good opportunity to talk about compassionate curiosity. So this is my approach to difficult conversations, and it helps you with the external conversation with other people, but also the internal negotiation with yourself for emotion management and decision making. So it's the same 3 steps each time. Step number 1 is acknowledge and validate emotions. So we're going to label the emotions in the room. Step 2 is going to be getting curious with compassion. So we're going to ask open-ended questions with a compassionate tone. And step number 3 is joint problem solving. So we're going to work with the other side to figure out what the solution is. So we can see externally how that can flow in a conversation. We recognize they're emotional. It might say, hey, Jason, I can tell that this is having an impact on you, or it seems like this is frustrating for you. Then I'll give you space to share your feelings. Then I'll ask more questions, and then we'll work together to solve the problem. But internally, what I'm going to do is I'm going to label everything that I'm feeling. What am I feeling? I feel disrespected. I feel angry. I feel scared. Whatever it happens to be, I'm going to label that for myself. And then number 2, I'm going to ask myself compassionate questions. I'm not going to judge myself for the way that I'm feeling. I'm going to try to get to the heart of this. Why am I feeling this way? Why do I believe this? And so I'm going to understand myself on a deeper level. And going through this process helps us to calm down. It helps us to regulate our emotions and gives us more clarity. Now, step number 3, this is where we use joint problem solving internally. So reconciling the differences between our hearts and our minds. So what would satisfy me emotionally in this situation? What would actually satisfy me substantively in terms of what should I actually do in the real world? And so if you go through this preparation internally, it helps you to get a better understanding of yourself and manage your emotions at the same time. Then coming into the conversation, if you can come to the conversation prepared to ask questions, so writing down 5 to 10 questions you might ask during the conversation, and then coming up with some potential solutions for the problem, even something as simple as that is a great starting point for your preparation for the difficult conversation.
Amazing. And folks, if you're not taking notes on all of this, by the way, rewind about 20 minutes, 25 minutes and start taking notes again, because this is gold, absolute gold. And then yet another example, Kwame, of how generous you are with your expertise. And can I just also make an observation or ask a question, another question around one of the big challenges that my clients seem to face? And you did an episode on your podcast a little while ago with Chris DeSantis about generational friction. This is a very, very relevant topic for my listeners, and I hear this challenge all of the time. So you explore differences in mindset between generations and how that influences the perception of people from different generations, and which then influences our biases and how we go into hard conversations, especially where people aren't aware of their biases. So where should someone start who might be experiencing the issue of generational friction and, I guess, general building of the relationship?
Yeah, this is a tough one. Because it's inherently awkward when in that type of scenario. And I think in those types of situations, what you have to do is you want to show respect to the person who is older by demonstrating the fact that you recognize their experience and you appreciate their experience too. And so going into the conversation, I might say something like, Jason, you've been at the company for 10 years and I'm excited to work with you because I know you have a lot that you bring to the table, right? Just a little emotional payment like that, a little recognition helps to thaw the ice that could be surrounding the conversation. Because coming into it, we want to address the bias. We want to kind of take a preemptive strike at a potential bias. This young buck doesn't know what they're talking about. They shouldn't be leading me. They don't even know how smart I am. And so what you do is you just say, hey, I see you're smart and you earned your intelligence through your experience. I see that. Like, oh, okay. It kind of just, it calms people down and it starts the conversation off with a little bit more positive momentum, because again, it's very awkward. And I think if we try to play this game where we pretend like this awkwardness is not happening, that's what makes it more awkward.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that we can just address it straight up at the beginning of the conversation.
Yeah, fantastic. I think that's such a helpful tip. And it really is a very common challenge for people, and not only in professional life too, right? So these are all things that affect us in our private lives as well. But can I ask you though, Kwame, for the tradesperson or the contractor who feels awkward, I guess, acknowledging that they need to develop their EQ, and what's the value proposition that you would put forward to them to, I guess, encourage them to just accept and be vulnerable enough to do the work? What's the value proposition to do the work?
The value proposition is they have everything it takes in order to be an emotional, intelligent leader. And the first thing it takes is the self-awareness to recognize that there is a gap between where they currently are and where they want to be. And the second thing is that all it requires is work ethic. Because the folks who are in your audience, they are not afraid of hard work. They know what that means. And they're used to putting in hard work in their jobs. They're used to putting in hard work to develop their skills. This is just another skill that you need to work at, but the productive pain that we will feel will be different and a little bit unfamiliar. Because if I'm putting in long hours on a job site, okay, that might take physical and mental energy, right? That's I can understand what that productive pain feels like because it's familiar to me. Now, this is an emotional productive pain. And we might have been able to advance in our career in the trades because of our ability to be very stoic and manage our emotions and keep that quiet in order to achieve high performance in that particular role. But now we have to recognize that the discomfort we're going to have to feel in order to improve this skill is very different. We have to open ourselves up in order to grow. And so I just want to change people's mindset and let them know that the discomfort, the awkwardness, the fear of vulnerability, that's something that everybody goes through on this journey. That's something that I went through. Today, I was just reviewing my StrengthsFinder results. So StrengthsFinder is a skills test, and it rates your skills, your natural abilities from 1 to 34, your professional abilities. And so number 34, the very last strength I had when I took that test was empathy. Number 34, right? And when I told my friends that, they were shocked. They're like, they're wrong. It's wrong. You're very empathetic. And I said, well, I am not naturally empathetic, but empathy is a skill. I recognized I wasn't as empathetic as I needed to be. And so I spent years honing the skill of empathy. It wasn't easy, but now I'm very empathetic. And people see me as an empathetic leader, an empathetic negotiator, and I can create strong relationships by the power of empathy. And really, all empathy is at the end of the day is understanding the other side. So it's not sympathy where you're feeling what the other side is feeling, which is dangerous in a difficult conversation because it might lead you to make inappropriate concessions just because of somebody's emotional state. But if you can understand their perspective, how are they seeing the situation? What are their thoughts around the situation? And what are their feelings around the situation? That is invaluable information that I can utilize in this conversation to be more effective and develop a deeper connection. Because again, at the end of the day, it's people connecting with people. And if we can learn to empathize and we can improve our emotional intelligence, it'll amplify our ability to do that.
Absolutely. And folks, again, so many nuggets here. So, and I'm sure you would agree, Kwame, that a really great place to start on this journey for people in this position would be your book, Finding Confidence in Conflict. For me, that was a mindset shift to reframe how I viewed conflict, because I think that for me, that was the biggest thing, is when I reframed my perception of what conflict is and the opportunities that sit within those situations, that's where everything starts to change. So
thank you. I appreciate that. That means a lot. Yeah, that book was challenging for me too, in terms of vulnerability, because you could see like page 1 was very vulnerable.
Yeah.
But it was I have to give thanks to my podcast audience too, because I surveyed them to see what it is that they wanted to hear about. And I was excited to write a very nerdy and technical negotiation book. I'm like, oh man, this is going to be great. There are going to be so many tactics in this. It's going to be a strategic masterpiece. But then when I saw the survey results, the words that came up the most were confidence and conflict. People were afraid of conflict and they didn't have the confidence to put the skills into action when it mattered. So it's really a mindset book because it helps you to evaluate what is holding you back, help you to recognize your own personal psychological and emotional barriers to high performance so you can work through those. And then it delves into how you can utilize compassionate curiosity to make your difficult conversations easier. So Yeah, I'm glad you like it, man. That's great.
Awesome. Yeah. And for me, one of the biggest impacts that I have seen in my own growth is, I guess, the cross pollination of how easier things got between my professional life and my personal life. Is that a consistent theme that you see with the people that you mentor?
Yes, absolutely. I'll tell you, in October, I did 2 real estate keynote speeches, and the feedback I got was so fascinating. And so 2 people said the exact same piece of feedback in the exact same way. And they said it as a joke, but they were serious. They said, I think you might have saved my marriage. That's what they got. Of course, they learned how to make better deals. Of course, they learned how to make better business relationships. But it's that eye-opening response where people realize, whoa, no. This is more than just negotiation. And that's what I really want to people to fully appreciate. Because again, the best things in life are on the other side of difficult conversations. And if you can start to recognize how you can utilize these skills to create these connections at home and at work, you realize that this is really the missing link when it comes to happiness and success, right? We might have the right answer, we can't communicate it. We might care, but we can't communicate that either. But once you master this skill, now we are putting ourselves in position to live the very best version of our life.
Wow. And talk about value proposition. There's a whole lot of value there, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Kwame, before we wrap up, we hinted on some news that you might have to offer the Australian audience. Is it time for a little bit of a hint?
Yes. This is going to be a heck of a hint.
I'm so excited about this.
Yes. So December 2024, we are making Australia happen. So we're going to put on a workshop open to the public in Melbourne. So excited about that. And my hope is that the plan is that I'm going to bring my whole family, spend a month there. So hopefully we can get some other gigs while we're there, so we can travel to different spots. But I'm excited. And for folks who have been following Negotiate Anything for a long time, I hope you see the comedic value in this, because I shared the story about the last time I tried to make it to Australia, and it was a clown show. So I'm going to finally do it, and I'm excited to pull it off. And Jason, you're playing a big role in this, so I appreciate your support in this too.
My pleasure, Kwame, of course. And I know that there'll be a lot of people in Australia very excited about this. So where should they go to keep tabs on this and to follow you and benefit from your expertise? Where can people go?
I appreciate it. So yes, let's check out the Negotiate Anything podcast. Updates coming up there all the time, but I post every single day on LinkedIn. I'm building up my Instagram following too. So those are the best ways to get in touch. And if you're interested in connecting with me, seeing what we do, and maybe talking about doing a speaking event, something like that, check out AmericanNegotiationInstitute.com.
Fantastic. And we'll be sure to put those details in the show notes as well. And Kwame, thank you for the content that you make available to everyone as well. You are very generous with your expertise and your time, and it certainly has helped me in my leadership journey. So, and I know how hard it is for you to find gaps in your schedule. So I can't tell you how grateful I am that you've spent some time with us today.
Hey man, it is my pleasure. I appreciate you, and kudos on all the great work you're doing. I'm really happy that you were able to start this podcast, and you're paying it forward too. So the work that you do is very important. So thank you for that.
Thanks so much, Kwame. There you have it, folks. Thanks for tuning in for another episode of The Growth Project. I'm really enjoying the interaction, so please keep the messages and emails coming through. Keep an eye out for our upcoming Frontline Leader Mindset workshops at entertrain.com.au. They're in Sydney and Melbourne. And of course, you can reach out to request a private customized workshop for your team. Again, that's entertrain.com.au. That's ENERTRAIN.com.au. What would really help us send our leadership insights far and wide is 5-star ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, or even just share the show with your network, family, and friends. Until the next episode, look after yourself and look after your teams.